Was Billy the Kid ordinary? I saw this question in a comment section. Did and does he deserve the fame he has had? Well, here is how he got famous after his death. The name Billy the Kid had all but been forgotten until 1916 when Walter Noble Burns, a reporter, was sent to Columbus, New Mexico, to report on Pancho Villa's raid there. Another interesting story. While having a drink at a saloon, he saw a big Colt hanging on the wall behind the bar. He asked the bartender, "What's the story on that old shooting iron?" and was told it was the gun that killed Billy the Kid. He then asked, "Who is Billy the Kid? By the way, that gun sold for $6 million a couple of years ago." A few years later, Mr. Burns returned to New Mexico, drove out to Fort Sumner, and interviewed Pauletta Maxwell, Sally Chisholm, and others who had known the kid. He then wrote a book called The Saga of Billy the Kid. This book, more than any other, made the kid famous. A copy was even found in Bonnie and Clyde's car after their deaths, but even during his early life he was known. His name was mentioned in newspapers as Kid Antrim, as early as 1875-76. There is no doubt that it took a little bit of luck to bring Billy fame, but luck only comes to those who deserve it. After his capture at Stinking Springs, a reporter asked him, "Looks like you've been getting pretty famous lately. What do you think of that?" The kid just looked at him and said, "There's no money in it. If he only knew his photograph would sell for $2.3 million 130 years later." I've listened to Bob Bosbell, editor of True West magazine, speak of this, and noting how interesting these details are, to which I agree. He should have just held onto the photo a little longer. He was also quoted saying, as people were all staring at him through his bars, "This is good. Maybe people will think I'm half human now because they have thought of me as an animal before. Maybe now they will look at me as half human." He did look human indeed. One reporter wrote, "There was nothing very mannish about him. He had a smooth face like a schoolboy, with traditional silky fuzz on his upper lip and clear blue eyes that had a roguish snap about them." One of the central reasons for his popularity is that he wasn't a typical outlaw. He didn't rob banks and trains. He was well liked by most and extremely charismatic. So, to conclude, was Billy ordinary? Not a chance. A man does not reach the sort of fame he has by being ordinary. George Coe said years later that Billy would take a Colt 6-shooter in each hand, cock both guns, and spin one forward and one backward. He would shoot moving targets and could pick a handkerchief off the ground from the back of his horse at a gallop. He always rode the finest horses, and at the end of his life his famous bay mare was legendary as being the fastest thing on 4 feet. Pauletta Maxwell, interviewed after his death, said the single picture we have of him doesn't do him justice. He was described as charming and handsome by men and women alike. The kid was a legend locally even when he was alive, and especially after he escaped jail in Lincoln 2 weeks before he was to be hanged. This is when he became the legend we know and crossed into the stratosphere. I'm going to enclose the story of his escape here, because I believe it is central in helping the reader to see how this event propelled the kid into legend. Billy the Kid's escape. The single most important event that cemented Billy the Kid's legend was his escape from the Lincoln County Courthouse on April 28, 1881, after his capture at Stinking Springs by Pat Garrett. But before getting to the story of Billy's trial and escape, here's another instance of the kid's daring came after his capture at Stinking Springs. The posse took their prisoners to Fort Sumner, and while they were eating inside, they left Jim East, one of the posse members, outside to guard them. Billy and Dave Rudabaugh were shackled together, and because of the cold, they had started a fire in the fireplace to keep warm. As they stood warming themselves, Billy called out to East, "Hey, do you have any tobacco?" East pulled out his tobacco pouch and was about to throw it to Billy, but the kid smirked and said, "I'll come get it." He then started walking toward East, still chained to Rudabaugh. Halfway across the room, it suddenly dawned on East that this could be a trap. His instincts kicked in, and he quickly pulled his 6-gun, cocked it, and ordered Billy to stop right there. Rather than argue, East tossed the tobacco the rest of the way. Billy looked at it for a moment, then tossed it back and shuffled back to the fire, grinning. This was yet another perfect example of the kid's daring and ingenuity, always testing the nerves of those around him, always one step ahead, even in captivity. Following his capture, Billy's trial was set for April 13, 1881, in Mesilla, New Mexico, where he was tried at the Dona Ana County Courthouse. There was no question that the trial was rigged from the start. Judge Warren Bristol, a known member of the corrupt Santa Fe ring, hated the kid and had no intention of letting him walk free. Billy had actually struck a deal with Governor Lew Wallace a year earlier. In exchange for his testimony before a grand jury regarding the murder of Houston Chapman, Wallace had promised him a pardon. Chapman, Susan McSween's lawyer, had been killed in a drunken fiasco by Jimmy Dolan and Billy Campbell, shortly after Billy and his allies had attempted to broker a peace deal with Dolan's men in Lincoln, New Mexico. Knowing tensions were high, both groups met on opposite sides of an adobe wall to avoid violence, but Jesse Evans immediately threatened to kill the kid. If not for the wall between them, the meeting could have turned into a shootout. Eventually, a truce was agreed upon, and the men celebrated by going bar hopping. Billy Campbell and Jimmy Dolan became drunk and reckless, while the kid, who wasn't known to drink much, remained at least reasonably sober. As Chapman walked the streets of Lincoln that night, Campbell taunted him, firing at his feet and demanding that he dance. When Chapman refused, Campbell shot him. Dolan fired the second shot, finishing him off. Billy's testimony led to indictments against Campbell and Dolan, but Campbell fled to Texas, and nothing ever came of the case against Dolan. Governor Wallace, despite his promise, left town and abandoned the deal, while District Attorney William Reinerson refused to honor it. That betrayal sealed Billy's fate. By the time he stood trial in Mesilla, the court was determined to see him hang. Judge Bristol misled the jury, which consisted entirely of Hispanic men who spoke little English, basically instructing them that if Billy was in the county at the time of Sheriff Brady's murder, he was guilty. But to sentence Billy to death, they needed a first-degree murder conviction, which required proof that the killing was premeditated. The murder of Buckshot Roberts was dismissed on jurisdictional grounds, so the focus remained on Sheriff William Brady's death. Since 6 shooters had fired on Brady, it was nearly impossible to prove who had delivered the fatal shot, let alone that it had been premeditated. A second-degree murder charge would have been more reasonable, but that wouldn't have resulted in a hanging sentence. Judge Bristol's false instructions ensured Billy was convicted of first-degree murder. After his sentencing, he was transported to Lincoln, where he was to be hanged on May 13, 1881. The final insult was the men assigned to guard him, Bob Ollinger and John Kinney. Kinney was a known outlaw, and Ollinger was a notorious backshooter who even Pat Garrett admitted he never trusted. It was well known that Ollinger and Billy hated one another. Bob had shot Billy's friend John Jones in the back, and Billy had sworn revenge, and really was blamed for being the one to kill Robert Beck with one of Ollinger's good friends during the 5-day battle in Lincoln. During the long ride to Lincoln from Mesilla, Ollinger taunted Billy repeatedly, threatening him many times with his Whitney shotgun. In one book I read, I think it may have been Ron Hansen's book, The Kid, the author writes about an incident that took place while Billy was being held in the courthouse. Ollinger laid his pistol on the floor, then kicked it over toward Billy, saying, "I hear you're so fast you could fan 4 shots into me before I get this Whitney cocked." Billy, looking at him coolly, simply kicked the gun back. Ollinger chuckled and said, "Scared, huh?" which I am quite certain didn't sit well with the kid. Whether it was intentional or not, forcing Billy to be guarded by men far worse criminals than himself was a clear slap in the face. On April 28, 1881, with his execution just 2 weeks away, Billy saw his chance. Pat Garrett had left town to White Oaks to collect lumber for the gallows, leaving him under the watch of James Bell and Bob Ollinger. In his book, Pat Garrett writes that he had warned them not to be taken in by the kid's charm, and to keep someone watching him at all times, saying if they allowed him the use of one hand, or gave him a moment, at any time he would devise a plan and kill the whole lot of them before they even knew he had such a plan. Historians generally agree that Bell escorted Billy to the outhouse, and on the way back up the courthouse stairs the kid made his move. Some accounts suggest he hurried up the stairs and rounded the corner, slipped one wrist free from his shackles, and then struck Bell over the head with the cuffs, wounding him badly. In the scuffle, Billy seized Bell's revolver and told him he didn't want to shoot him. He called out to him to surrender so he could lock him in the armory. But Bell panicked and ran, forcing Billy to fire. Bell stumbled down the stairs, staggered out the back door and collapsed, dead. His fall was witnessed by Godfrey Gauss, a local gardener. Billy then hopped down the hall, still partially shackled, forced open the armory door, and retrieved Bob Ollinger's shotgun, a double-barreled Gage Whitney. Now armed, Billy made his way back to his holding room and waited. He knew that Ollinger, hearing the gunshot, would be rushing back from across the street where he had taken other prisoners for dinner. Every time I get to this part of the story, I imagine the great historian Robert Utley as he described it. Ollinger sitting in the restaurant, and upon hearing the shot, he lifts his head tilted sideways and says, "Do you hear that? Did you hear that? Was that a shot?" And the sinking feeling Pecos Bob must have felt in the pit of his stomach. According to legend, as Ollinger stepped onto the street, Billy's voice rang out from above, "Hello, Bob." Before Ollinger could even react, Billy unleashed a blast of buckshot into his face and shoulder, killing him instantly. The kid then, going out on the porch, broke in half the shotgun, according to some accounts, threw the broken weapon down at Ollinger's body, saying, "There, old fellow, you won't be bothering me with that thing again." Now completely free inside the courthouse, Billy ordered Godfrey Gauss to bring him a pickaxe, which he used to break off his remaining shackles. He then stepped onto the balcony where a crowd had gathered, and held court with the townspeople. He declared that he hadn't wanted to kill Bell, but that he was glad he had sent Pecos Bob Ollinger to hell. Then he spoke out in this fashion. "It's me, Pat, against the world. I don't want to hurt anyone else, but if you get in my way, I will. I have not thought myself a bad man heretofore, but now I guess I will show the world what a bad man is." I think this in itself helps us see how Billy really was not a hardened criminal, at least not in the way most criminals were of that time, because after his escape of the courthouse, he killed no one, he didn't rob anybody that we know of, and even though he said he would show the world what a bad man was, he never acted on it. Gauss then saddled a horse for him, and Billy made his way down to the street. But as he mounted, the horse spooked and bucked him off. The townspeople held their breath as the legendary outlaw hit the dirt, but Billy just dusted himself off, grinned, and had someone catch his horse and it to him. This time, he mounted without incident. When the Kid rode out of Lincoln on April 28, 1881, he crossed from being a mortal man into becoming a mythical legend. We still struggle to know the truth about his life. He was an unlikely hero, but we identify with him, the underdog fighting alone against terrible odds. Against the law, yes, but a very corrupt, murderous law, a law far worse, responsible for many more deaths than the Kid. There were roughly 200 men and 80 murders committed during the Lincoln County War, yet the Kid was the only one anyone even attempted to hold accountable. The historian Paul Hutton once said, "The Kid was too famous, he had to die." He thumbed his nose at the corrupt Santa Fe ring, a highly connected group of government crooks. But the key to his fame lay in his personality. He was intelligent, quick-witted, and funny. He was good with a gun in a pinch, a great dancer, and a kind, caring friend. He was orphaned young and grew up in a hard land among hard men, always searching for a family. And when the law wouldn't punish those who killed his friends, the only family he had, he took it upon himself to deliver justice as he saw fit. The haughty politicians didn't appreciate his help, and ultimately he paid the price. The Kid had a good sense of humor, laughed constantly, and never dwelled on the past. He was always looking to the future. The people who knew him loved him. He was loyal and defended his friends with a viciousness that Pat Garrett later wrote about. A person must look in his eyes for an exhibition of anger. Filled with cold hatred, his eyes glistened and danced, but his lips were always turned up in a smile. It was hard to believe that those dancing cold eyes and that laughing face were controlled by the same spirit. And as he rode out of Lincoln whistling, his place in history was sealed. When the Kid rode out of Lincoln on April 28, 1881, he crossed from being a mortal man into becoming a mythical legend. We still struggle to know the truth about his life. He was an unlikely hero, but we identify with him, the underdog fighting alone against terrible odds. I like to think of him as the great historian Frederick Nolan described him in one interview. I heard him say he was a kid, yes, but a kid he would want for your own son.